And now let's move on to our third and final speaker. That's Nigel Topping, the UK High-Level Climate Action Champion at the Cabinet Office. Nigel, over to you.
Hi, Julia, and good evening, everyone. It's lovely to join you. I thought I'd actually start just by saying a little bit about what the COP26 in Glasgow is next year and what it isn't, because it's complicated and it's often misreported. And then I'll just try to explain what a high-level climate action champion is and some of what I do. So I think it's quite important to understand that the Conference of the Parties, that's what COP stands for, which means the parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is not an event where the world leaders are going to renegotiate what everyone's doing on climate change, as is often reported. Actually, it's a very technical negotiation, the rules of which were set in Paris. So the real international deal was done in Paris, and since then, it's really about following the rules. So there's really three things going on in Glasgow. The first is that the technical negotiations continue, and that's both making sure that some previous commitments are being met. For example, a commitment by countries of the global north to contribute at least $100 billion a year by 2020 to those in the developing world to address the asymmetry of cause and effect between the countries that have caused climate change and those who are disproportionately vulnerable to its impact. The other thing that's being negotiated is the final bits of the Paris Rulebook. So Paris set the general direction, the overall target, the overall mechanisms, but it's very technical rules like how to measure and transparently account for country emissions, or how to account for trading of carbon credits between countries. So those are quite technical issues which haven't been finalized yet, and those need to be finalized. And one thing that everyone should understand is that the UN Climate Convention is a construct which requires consensus. So over 190 sovereign states have to agree on every punctuation mark. They literally sign off every sentence. It's a very high bar in terms of democratic processes, and that has its advantages and its disadvantages. One real advantage is that it empowers small countries. So Carol was talking about small island developing states. So those are the countries who in Paris were chanting 1.5 to stay alive, as the developed world was talking about a 2-degree target. They were saying, no, you don't understand. This really is existential for us. So a lot of those smaller countries, and the countries who identify themselves as the climate vulnerable countries, smaller and less developed coastal communities in particular, feel real agency in this UN climate process, which they don't feel in other processes. If you think about the G7, you're not invited. G20, you're not invited. If the Security Council, you maybe get invited once in a blue moon. So there's a real importance to that, and that's one of the reasons why actually those countries have been so adamant that they supported a postponement if they couldn't meet in person, because to them there's again another asymmetry is if you have to do these things digitally, then a small island state doesn't have access to the same infrastructure and is disenfranchised, relatively speaking, in a global negotiation. So the first thing that's happening that is really important, although because of the politics of multilateralism, is the finalization of some of the rules and the checking of the implementation of some previous agreements. The second thing that's happening, which we just heard about, is the contributions from individual nation states, the nationally determined contributions, the national plans. How much is each country committing to reduce its emissions by in the next 5 to 10 years? So particularly we're all focused on 2030, where scientists told us in the International Panel on Climate Change's report on 1.5 degrees that basically we need to halve emissions by 2030 and get to zero by 2050 if we want to have a reasonable chance of keeping emissions below 1.5. And again, you also those risk bars that as we go above 1.5, we start to get into very dangerous territory in terms of triggering risk and in terms of triggering some tipping points as well. So so the first thing that's happening is the negotiations, quite technical but important politically. Second thing is countries coming up with their nationally determined contributions. Now, those were required under Paris to be submitted and ratcheted, I enhanced every 5 years. This is why COP26 is so important. It's the 5th conference of the parties after Paris. So it's the first test. Is the Paris Agreement working? Is that red arrow, that scary red arrow that sits at 3.2 degrees, coming down, and how far, how close can we get it to 1.5? Now, Paris didn't say we got to get to 1.5 degrees. Paris said we're going to aim for well below 2 degrees and do the best that we can to get to 1.5. But the science has really firmed up since then. So for most actors, net zero by 2050, to have a good chance of 1.5 is the new North Star. So negotiations, national plans. The national plans were due the end of this year. Of course, because of COVID-19, the conference itself has been postponed, and countries are struggling, some of them, to do all the hard work to come up with the plans to present their new targets by the end of this year. Nevertheless, and significantly changed in the last 2 months. The expectations are high, and the UK, as the president of the conference for this year, it rotates every year, along with Chile, the president last year, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, have called nations to come up with their best plans by the 12th of December, the 5th anniversary of the gavel coming down of the Paris Agreement. 2 months ago, the political headwinds were considerable, but a lot has changed in the last 2 months. We already knew that the UK and the EU would come up with very strong NDCs. We didn't know, but everyone expected that were in line with net zero by 2050. The EU is talking about 55% reduction in emissions by 2030. The UK is waiting for advice from its climate change committee, but that's expected in soon, and then soon after, maybe at the 12th or maybe before. Everyone's expecting that the UK government will make its announcement and expect it to be in the 60s, not 55, so it's considerably more ambitious than Europe. What's changed in the last few months is that China, at the UN General Assembly in September, said they were going to commit to net zero before 2060. China, biggest emitter in the world, has a track record of under-promising and over-delivering. So most of us in the community take that as their sort of down payment on a net zero 2050 plan. Japan has committed to net zero 2050. South Korea, net zero 2050. Two big industrialized, heavy emitting economies. Those 3 countries are also the 3 main funders of the remaining bits of coal fired power stations that are being built, a lot of them in Southeast Asia, in places like Vietnam and Philippines. So them all saying they're committed to net zero and following up with commitments to stop financing new coal-fired power plants is also really helpful. And of course, most recently, the outcome of the presidential election in the States has become clear. And so we will have, from January the 20th next year, US administration, second biggest emitter, biggest economy, which is committed to coming back in the Paris Agreement and to setting very ambitious goals, which one could take to mean or to expect that the USA will also commit to a net zero 2050 NDC before we get to Glasgow. It will take them some time because that's a complicated thing to do. If we had a second Trump administration, as you probably all know, formally the USA came out of the Paris Agreement on the 4th of November, and there was no reason for them to be back in. Actually, it's a relatively straightforward thing for a new president by executive order to bring them back in. And then Canada recently said they're going to commit to net zero. So suddenly in 2 months, we're going from having not much big economy commitment to net zero 2050 to having a lot. So that's looking good. The third thing which happens in Glasgow, and that's where my role comes in. I should explain my role. I don't actually work for the Cabinet Office, so sorry about any miscommunication there. My role, high-level champion for climate action, was created in Paris. At the time, I was running an NGO, a coalition called We Mean Business, which is working to drive and support businesses making big changes to get to a net zero economy. Until a few years before Paris, there was no role in those conversations for businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, civil society. Obviously, all those actors have huge role. If you think about it, the combined turnover of Amazon and Apple is greater than the bottom 83 countries. If you look at the Pareto of countries by GDP and add up those bottom ones, you know, Tokyo has a population of well over 20 million. California has an economy that would make it the 5th biggest economy in the world. Cities around the world are where policy and infrastructure and ideas are innovated, and many of the solutions are tried out first in cities. So what Paris did in recognition of that reality was create this role to say, okay, the formal agreement is a multilateral negotiation between nation states, so there's no place for anybody else there. But in the political conversation and in the economic conversation about grappling with how do we make such a massive transformation, we need everybody. So the high-level champions role, my job is to work with non-state actors, that's what the UN system calls everyone who's not a government with a seat at the negotiating table, to drive ambition and action, and by doing so support countries in being more ambitious. So that's my job. I work with the high-level champion from Chile because it's a 2-cycle job, and Chile is the president of COP25. And simply put, we are working to connect what we call the ambition loop. So as you get more ambition from businesses and cities, it makes it easier for countries to raise their ambition. As countries raise their ambition, so that loop is closed and it makes it easier for those other actors. Prime example would be the recent announcement of the UK to phase out combustion engines in 2030. In 2016, the International Energy Agency was telling everybody that we'll still be building and buying combustion engine cars in 2070. 2016, Tesla comes along, starts disrupting with a rather cool and fast and fully electrically powered car. Changes the perception that all electric vehicles are C5s or milk floats, for those of you who remember those days. Then in 2018, the UK and France announced a 2040 ban of combustion engines. Then in 2019, Mercedes, the inventor of the commercial combustion engine, says they will be net zero by 2039. Then we start having lots of citizens saying they're demanding faster climate action. That changed the policy environment. Then we start having lots of cities like London and Paris saying that they'll have carbon-free zones. So you see that all the influences start coming around, and that changes the politics so that it's much easier for the UK to set a 2030 target. Meanwhile, the compound reduction in costs of 20% a year continues, so that we know that by 2024, electrically powered cars will be cheaper to buy and much cheaper to run and last longer and be easier to maintain than combustion engine cars. So my job now is working to drive that sort of systems change across all those non-state actors, across all sectors of the economy. And we run that through something we call the Race to Zero, which is a big campaign with thousands of companies, cities, universities, and we'll soon be launching a Race to Resilience as well. I think I've probably spoken enough, so I should hand back to Julia so that we can get into Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nigel. A few quick questions before we go on to the main Q&A. Could you tell us a bit more about the Race to Zero dialogues and also the Race to Resilience? That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so the Race to Zero is like a headline campaign which Gonzalo and I launched in June to encourage everybody to commit to getting to zero as soon as possible. We like to say get to zero by the 2040s. It's a race because of the science that's been laid out for us, and zero is a staging point. Actually, we want to get to a regenerative economy where we're drawing down more carbon than we're emitting so that we can start to undo some of the damage, although some of it is irrevocable. So we launched that campaign to try and get as many businesses, and it's going really well. And we have a lot of momentum. Our objective was to get 10 times as many businesses, investors, etc. by the time we get to Glasgow. We've got well over 1,000 businesses, over 500 universities, about 500 cities, investors who are managing $5 trillion worth of assets, all committed to get to net zero, some by 2050, some by 2040, some by 2030. And that's all backed by solid science. So there's actually an initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which takes the best available science and looks at the technology pathways that are known, and then defines methodologies for businesses and cities to be able to say that they've got a target which is in line with 1.5 degrees. And the overall Race to Zero has some meta criteria. Gonzalo and I don't sit in a room taking in targets from businesses and cities and deciding whether they're good enough. It's an umbrella campaign we've created, but we require that all those campaigns require that the entities that they're endorsing as having net zero targets have a long-term target that gets them to zero before 2050, or by as late as possible, as early as possible, but 2050 is the latest we allow. That they have a short-term plan. Of course, a mayor or a CEO says I'm going to be at zero in 2050 is probably not going to be in post by then. So we require they have short-term 5 and 10 year targets, and then that they demonstrate over the years that they're proceeding to implement their plan and that they're publishing. So we talk about pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. The race, so that's going really well. We just had the Race to Zero dialogues, which is where we bring together people to explore the pathways. We've published pathways to zero. We have a pathway. We know how to get to zero in every one of those sectors. We maybe haven't invented or don't know the last bit of technology, but we have enough certainty to know that we can get to zero, and we certainly know what people need to do in the next 5-10 years to be on track. So we've published those pathways, and these dialogues were an attempt to have better conversations around the difficult issues about how we go down those pathways to zero. And then the Race for Resilience is something we're about to launch, which in the politics and the practicality of climate change, there's often a sort of yin yang between mitigation, getting to zero, and adaptation, like adapting to the changes which are now inevitable. The 3 times the severe weather events that we're already facing at 1 degree rise. And so the issue of resilience, particularly around lives and livelihoods, is at the heart of that climate justice, that cause and effect asymmetry that I talked about. So we'll be launching a Race for Resilience later in the year, and then really focusing on that alongside the Race to Zero next year. And that will really be looking at the most vulnerable lives and livelihoods in the world community. So particularly urban poor, smallholder farmers. So that's 1 billion slum dwellers, 2 billion who rely on smallholder farmers for their income, and then more broadly those who are exposed to disaster, which are particularly coastal and river communities exposed to extreme weather events. So that's the idea. We'll launch that and aim to have momentum in all of those campaigns by the time we get to Glasgow.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nigel. And just one other question, if I may. I mean, you've got five or six key themes, I think, for COP26. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about those themes?
Yeah, so I should just distinguish. So my role is created by the parties to the UN Convention. So my mandate comes from them, but of course I'm appointed by the presidency. I'm appointed by the Prime Minister. Then the UK has the presidency of COP26. So that means that Alok Sharma, who's the incoming president, has to preside over those negotiations. Very, very complicated. But the UK, as a government that's taken on this presidency, has also, as the UK government said, that they're going to drive 5 particular campaigns, as you say, which I work very closely to make sure we're aligned. And those 5 are around phasing out the combustion engine. So that's a pretty big tick for the UK with their recent announcement. Around the energy transition, particularly how that's managed from a sort of whole of economy and a societal point of view. We often talk about the just transition, that if you just shut coal mines and coal-fired power plants, in South Africa or China, those are big employers. So how do you manage that transition? Nature-based solutions, we've heard a bit about that. So particularly, how do we get deforestation out of supply chains? 4 commodities, palm, soy, beef, and timber, are the drivers of most tropical deforestation. So we need to, and then campaigns on finance being led by Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, and on resilience, particularly looking at how developed countries can support better emerging economies. So those are the 5 campaigns of the UK government. And then because I work with a partnership of over 300 organizations globally across all sectors of the economy. So we've got like 25 different sectors that we're working on, but we're making sure we're aligned on those 5 in particular.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nigel.